In 1992, 10 lives disappeared overnight inside a quiet boarding school. For 19 years, families begged for answers, but the halls stayed silent. What finally surfaced in that abandoned dormitory was darker than anyone imagined. In the Maisu, summer of 1992, life in the small rural town of Weatherford carried a quiet rhythm. The town had just one high street, a scattering of brick houses, and the looming presence of St. Mary's boarding school that sat on the hill beyond the main road. Parents often said the school had been built too large for the town that surrounded it, a massive institution with dormitories, classrooms, and grounds that seemed designed for a bigger city. Yet for decades it had functioned like a proud landmark, a place where families from nearby counties sent their children to be shaped, disciplined, and, it was promised, prepared for better lives. The school's dormitory was where bonds formed. Students who spent their adolescence within those walls often described it years later as a strange mix of discipline and intimacy. Strict curfews were enforced, but whispered conversations carried through the hallways long after lights out. Staff tried to instill rules, but it was in the after hours that true personalities revealed themselves. Friendships that lasted, rivalries that cut deep. And beneath it all, there lingered the quiet unease of being in a place where the outside world felt very far away. In 1992, a particular group of young men and women, along with 2 trusted staff members, were known for their closeness. They weren't necessarily the most popular or the most gifted, but they were steady, reliable, and united in a way that set them apart. Teachers noticed how they worked together on assignments, how they supported each other in the cafeteria, how they always seemed to share secrets in corners. There was a wholesomeness to their togetherness, but also something quietly insular, as though their bond held things that others weren't meant to see. That summer, the group disappeared. It happened in a way that left no warning, no chance for intervention. One week they were attending lessons, working in the library, and seen laughing in the common room. By the next, they were gone. Their beds unmade. Their lockers emptied in strange, incomplete ways, some with personal effects left behind, others stripped bare as though their owners had never existed. The 2 staff members who guided them vanished too. No signs of a trip, no farewell notes, no sudden letters mailed to worried relatives. Just silence. At first, the administration insisted it was a prank. Boarding schools had dealt with runaway groups before, teenagers eager to make a statement, eager to taste freedom. But the hours turned to days, and the days to weeks, and no one returned. Police combed the countryside. Trains and buses were checked for tickets purchased under their names. Families gathered at the dormitory gates, demanding answers that never came. Investigators searched the dormitory in detail. They found oddities that gave the case its enduring chill. Shoes lined neatly beneath beds, as though no one had planned on leaving. Letters half-written to parents, describing the ordinary complaints of adolescence, suddenly abandoned mid-sentence. A mathematics textbook left open on a desk, a pencil still across the page. No sign of a struggle, no clear exit. Just an absence so sharp it unsettled every person who entered those rooms. The town descended into rumor. Some whispered of a pact, the kind of dramatic gestures youth were capable of. Others muttered about the 2 staff members who vanished, alongside them, whether they had led the group away, or whether they too had been taken against their will. The absence of evidence became the most terrifying fact of all. With nothing to hold on to, speculation bloomed, and when speculation grows unchecked, fear is never far behind. The school tried to move on. Within months, St. Mary's reopened its term. New students filled the empty beds. New staff members replaced the old. But something had shifted. Parents spoke with unease about sending their children there. Enrollment numbers began to fall. Teachers who remained whispered in break rooms about the unresolved absence, lowering their voices when children walked past. The parents of the vanished never moved on. They traveled miles to follow even the faintest rumor, a bus ticket purchased by someone with a similar name, a witness who claimed to see a group of young people hiking through the next county, a vague letter sent to a family that claimed to know the truth. All proved false. The years ahead would scatter these families into grief and suspicion. Some grew bitter, certain the school had hidden something. Others turned their suspicions against fellow parents, convinced there were secrets no one was willing to share. By the mid-90s, the dormitory itself seemed to carry a curse. Students reported creaking floors, unexplained drafts, a heaviness in the rooms once occupied by the vanished. Some said they could hear whispers when the halls went silent at night. Whether these were tricks of imagination or echoes of unease, no one could prove. But the stories grew, and parents listened. By the year 2000, the school had closed its doors for good. The building, once a proud institution, was left to rot. Windows shattered from thrown rocks, paint peeled and cracked. Vines clawed up the outer walls. Local children dared each other to step inside, to touch the walls of the dormitory where so many had disappeared. Some swore they saw shadows move behind windows. Others claimed they heard the sound of footsteps when the building stood empty. Yet for all the ghost stories, the reality was simpler and crueler. The truth of what happened in 1992 had never been found. 19 years later, the case was still whispered in hushed tones, still feared, still unsolved. The families who had once demanded answers were growing old, their energy consumed by decades of grief. But the dormitory had not given up all its secrets, and when the first new set of eyes stepped inside in 2011, carrying with them the determination to reopen what had long been considered unspeakable, those secrets finally began to stir. When the disappearance first hit the newspapers in 1992, it carried a strange, almost surreal tone. 10 people vanishing overnight, 8 students, 2 staff, from a place meant to be locked, supervised, and secure. The notion alone unsettled even the most hardened detectives who arrived at St. Mary's boarding school in those first days. The search began methodically. Every hallway, every dormitory room, every storage space was scoured. Uniformed officers walked with dogs through the grounds, circling the edges of the property, then pushing into the woods beyond. Helicopters searched the surrounding farmland, their blades echoing across quiet fields. What they expected was some sign of panic. Scattered belongings, broken glass, a trail into the countryside. What they found was nothing. But there was one detail, overlooked in early reports, that stayed in the memory of investigators. In one of the dormitory rooms, where the air already smelled of dust and abandonment, an officer pulled open a metal locker and noticed something strange. Inside, beneath the usual clutter of clothing and books, was a bottom drawer pulled slightly ajar. It looked ordinary at first, but when they tried to force it open, they found it stuck, as though something heavy had shifted behind it. When pried loose, the drawer revealed an odd scrap lodged inside, a torn piece of paper, yellowed even then, with just a few words written in frantic, rushed handwriting. The ink had bled slightly, but the words were unmistakable. "Don't let them find out." The note seemed out of place. Was it from a prank? A warning passed between students? Or the last message of someone who knew more than they dared to say? It was bagged and logged, yet strangely, it never made it into official reports shown to families. The officer who found it said later he wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was dismissed as irrelevant, a scrap without context. Perhaps it was something the school had urged police not to publicize. Whatever the reason, that small, unsettling clue faded into the archives. As the days of searching stretched on, rumors began to race through Weatherford. Some parents believed their children had been lured away. Others suggested they had stumbled into something sinister. Whispers spread about tunnels beneath the school, about wealthy patrons who visited at odd hours, about an old history of scandals hushed up in decades past. Nothing could be proven, but in the vacuum of evidence, people filled the silence with imagination. The police tried to follow logical paths. They tracked down old bus tickets, checked train stations, and combed through witness reports. A farmer in the next county swore he saw a group of young people walking across his fields late one evening. A woman running a roadside inn reported 2 men matching the description of the missing staff members buying food supplies. Both claims crumbled under scrutiny. The farmer's sighting was at the wrong time. The innkeeper's description matched no known detail once police pressed further. Then suspicion turned inward. Parents began to wonder if the missing staff, two adults entrusted with the care of the students, had played a darker role. Investigators questioned colleagues, uncovering fragments of personalities that gave pause. One was known to be strict, perhaps too strict. The other had debts, small ones, but debts nonetheless. Were these reasons to abduct 10 people? Or had the adults been victims as well? Forensic teams combed the dormitory again. They found odd inconsistencies, personal items deliberately removed, others strangely left behind. Shoes still beneath beds, but drawers empty. School uniforms hung neatly in closets, yet the casual clothes students wore on weekends had vanished. These were not the patterns of a chaotic escape. They suggested something chosen, something planned. And yet, how could all 10 slip away undetected? The dormitory was locked each night. Windows were barred on the lower floors. Staff rotated hall. Duty. For a group of that size to vanish without breaking doors or smashing glass meant either one of two things. They had help, or they had been let out by someone who held the keys. That theory poisoned trust. The families, once united in grief, turned on the school. Lawsuits were threatened. Heated meetings were held in the gymnasium, where officials promised answers that never came. The headmaster resigned within a year, unable to withstand the suspicion and anger. By then, enrollment had dropped so sharply that the school's closure became inevitable. Still, one detail clung to the minds of those closest to the case: the dormitory itself. Even as the building was abandoned, locals would talk about it as though it were alive, a place that held its secrets stubbornly, that resisted those who tried to uncover what had happened. Children dared each other to go inside after it was shuddered, often returning with trembling claims of hearing voices or footsteps on the upper floors. Whether those were tricks of the imagination or not, they reinforced what many already felt. The dormitory was not merely a building, but a silent witness. The note in the drawer was forgotten by most. Only a handful of officers remembered it, and fewer still spoke of it later. But in that small scrap, with its desperate scrawl of "Don't let them find out," lay the first glimpse of something deeper, something that would not surface again until nearly 2 decades later, when the building itself was reopened and its silence finally cracked. By the late 1990s, St. Mary's was no longer a school. The disappearance of 10 people had lingered too heavily in the halls, leaving the place impossible to salvage. Families pulled their children out, enrollment dwindled, and each passing year left the headmaster and the remaining staff staring at emptier classrooms. Eventually, the gates were closed for good. No one spoke of a reopening. The building became a monument to failure and to fear. The dormitory stood at the heart of it, its brick walls already beginning to crack, its paint curling away from the wood beneath. For a time, the town hoped someone would buy the property and repurpose it, turn the dormitory into apartments, tear it down for new housing, maybe even convert it into a retreat. But buyers never came. No developer wanted a building with that kind of history. When investors asked around, they were quietly warned, "Don't touch that place. Nothing good will come of it." And so the dormitory lingered, its windows dark, its doors chained. Silence pooled in its hallways like standing water. Dust settled over the desks, the lockers, the stairways where children once ran. What had once been a place of discipline and routine began to feel like a wound on the town, something no one wanted to look at but everyone knew was still there. Time passed. The townspeople grew older, but the story did not fade. If anything, it hardened into myth. Parents used the dormitory as a warning to their children. Don't go near the school at night. Don't step past the gates. Teenagers dared each other to sneak in, returning with wild stories of whispers, footsteps, and shadows moving through the upper windows. Some swore they had found handprints on the inside of glass, as though someone had pressed from within. Others described hearing desks scraping across the floor, even though the rooms were empty. Of course, most of these tales were born of nerves and exaggeration. But in a town where real silence still hung around an unsolved mystery, imagination thrived. The dormitory became a symbol of everything unresolved, the children who never came home, the questions that never found answers, the suspicion that something had been buried too deep to ever be unearthed. Police long ago closed their case files. Officially, the disappearance had been ruled inconclusive, with no signs of foul play that could be proved and no evidence to suggest the group had simply run away. It sat in a purgatory of explanations, too strange to classify, too cold to pursue further. But for the families who remained in town, it was worse than any verdict. A case without conclusion is a wound that never heals. Some of those families drifted away, unable to live in the shadow of the dormitory any longer. Others stayed, their grief shaping them into half-recognizable versions of the people they had once been. They passed the building daily, on walks, on drives, and refused to turn their eyes toward it, as though ignoring it could make it less real. But it was always there. Over the years, the building began to change shape in the community's imagination. To children, it was a haunted house, a place of dares and legends. To adults, it was a curse, proof that their town had been touched by something they could neither explain nor escape. And to the families of the vanished, it was both tomb and question mark, a place that contained, in its rotting walls, the truth no one had been able to find. Inside, the decay deepened. Ceilings sagged under the weight of leaks, lockers rusted. Beds sat untouched, their mattresses molded and sunken. Graffiti began to appear, the crude scrawls of teenagers who wanted to leave proof of their bravery. Some tagged the walls with names and dates, others left mocking messages. "We found them. You didn't." Each mark felt like another insult against the silence. But there were also more unsettling signs. On at least 2 occasions, vandals who snuck inside the dormitory claimed they found drawers that wouldn't open, as though jammed by something within. One boy, braver than most, forced one open with a crowbar and discovered nothing more than rotted wood and scraps of paper too faded to read. Still, he swore later that one of those scraps had the outline of handwriting on it, letters too smeared to decipher. He told anyone who would listen that it looked like a message, something left behind on purpose. Whether or not his story was true, it reignited the whispers. The dormitory wasn't just haunted by imagination, it was hiding something. By the time 2011 arrived, the building was a husk, weeds clawing up through cracks in the pavement, windows shattered into dark sockets, the word dormitory still barely legible on the faded sign above the entrance. To most, it was an eyesore. To a few, it was a place best avoided. And to one person, a reporter passing through Weatherford who stumbled across the old story, it was an opportunity. That reporter saw in the abandoned building not just decay, but potential. A mystery waiting to be reopened, a silence begging to be broken, and when they stepped inside, flashlight beams slicing through dust and shadows, they had no idea that the building was ready, after 19 years, to give up the first of its secrets. In the spring of 2011, Weatherford was a town most people passed through without stopping. Its main street had withered down to a handful of businesses, a hardware store, a diner that never closed, and a thrift shop that smelled faintly of mothballs. The larger stores had long since moved to the highway, leaving the town with an air of being forgotten. But forgotten places, sometimes, hold stories, and it was into this atmosphere that a reporter named Claire Whitman arrived. Claire wasn't local. She worked for a regional magazine out of Raleigh, mostly covering small-town features, pieces about festivals, folk musicians, eccentric characters. She had a habit of poking around in archives when visiting new places, following faint trails that other reporters ignored. Weatherford hadn't been on her map until she overheard 2 travelers at a roadside cafe whispering about the boarding school where 10 people vanished. At first, she dismissed it as one of those Appalachian ghost stories. But when she stopped at the county records office, curiosity tugging at her, she found a dusty file with yellowed newspaper clippings. Headlines from 1992 leapt off the page. 10. Missing in boarding school mystery. Police baffled by overnight disappearance. Families demand answers as search expands. The more she read, the colder she felt. These weren't stories about superstition. These were accounts of real families, real investigations, and real silence. What struck her most was the abrupt end of coverage. For weeks in 1992, the papers had been filled with speculation and updates. Then, as if someone had closed a door, the reports stopped. By late that summer, the mystery had vanished from print. No follow-ups. No features on the grieving families. Just absence, as if the story itself had been swallowed. That was when she drove to Weatherford. Her first stop was the diner on Main Street, where she asked the waitress, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, if she remembered the case. The woman's face tightened, her lips pursing into a line. "We don't talk about that," she said softly, sliding the coffee across the counter. Best to let the dead rest. But Claire had already sensed it. The silence wasn't peace. It was fear. Later that afternoon, she parked near the edge of town and walked toward the old school grounds. The dormitory loomed exactly as described in the records, windows gaping, the sign above the entrance barely clinging to the wall. The air carried that peculiar stillness abandoned buildings have, as though sound itself hesitated to linger. Claire hesitated too, her hand brushing the cold metal of the gate before she pushed it open. The crunch of weeds underfoot echoed too loudly. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the faint tang of mold and rust. Her flashlight cut a weak beam. Across dust-coated lockers, peeling paint, and the skeletons of beds long unused. She wasn't the first to step inside. Teenagers had left graffiti, and vandals had stripped away copper wiring. Yet there was still a strange order to certain rooms, as though some spaces had been left untouched. She noticed one locker whose door hung slightly open, its bottom drawer crooked, as if jammed against something unseen. For a moment she considered forcing it open, but she stopped. Instead, she snapped a photograph and moved on, marking it in her notes. What drew her attention most wasn't the vandalism, but the files she later unearthed. In the town's neglected archive room, beneath years of tax reports and building permits, she discovered a box labeled simply St. Mary's, 1992. Inside were documents the families had never seen, handwritten notes from investigators, statements from staff. Pages that should have been public, but somehow weren't. One sheet in particular chilled her. It was an inventory of items found in the dormitory rooms. The list was precise: shoes, textbooks, letters, uniforms. But beside one entry was a note scrawled in red pencil. Paper scrap with writing, evidence withheld, per request. Claire stared at those words until her hands began to shake. Evidence withheld? At whose request? And why? She began knocking on doors. Some residents refused to speak. Others shut their curtains when they saw her approach. But a retired officer, now in his 70s, agreed to meet her on his porch. His voice was rough with age, and his eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. As he spoke, "There was something in that building we weren't meant to find," he said. "Orders came down to keep certain details quiet. Don't ask me why. Maybe to protect the school, maybe to protect someone bigger than the school. I tried to forget about it. But you dig around, you'll stir up things people here spent years trying to bury." When Claire pressed him, he refused to elaborate, but she noticed the way his hands trembled when she mentioned the note. By the time dusk fell, Claire was back at the dormitory. The building loomed like a shadow against the fading sky. She stood in the doorway, listening to the quiet creak of wood, the rustle of leaves against broken glass. There was something here. She was sure of it now. Something physical, something that could explain at least part of the silence. She switched on her recorder, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. 19 years ago, 10 people disappeared from this building. Records were sealed, evidence withheld, and the families never received closure. Tonight I'm standing inside the dormitory where it happened, and I'm going to find out why this place has been left to rot with its secrets still inside. Her words echoed softly down the empty corridor. Somewhere in the building, a draft slammed a door, and the sound reverberated through the hollow space. Claire turned, her flashlight beam catching on rusted lockers and abandoned desks. The air felt heavier. She knew she was not standing in just another ruin. Something was waiting to be uncovered. Claire had learned over the years that abandoned buildings spoke in layers. At first, it was the silence that unnerved you, the stillness pressing against your ears. Then, once you let your breathing slow, you began to notice the smaller sounds, the groan of beams shifting, the whisper of wind through cracks, the flutter of dust stirred by your own footsteps. But beneath all that, sometimes, if you listened long enough, you could sense something else. The echo of what had once lived there. She felt that echo the moment she descended the stairwell leading toward the dormitory's basement. The door to the stairwell had been half blocked by fallen plaster, as though the building itself wanted to keep her from entering. She pushed through, her flashlight trembling across the walls. The deeper she went, the colder the air grew, the smell shifting from mildew to something sharper, iron, dust, and age. At the bottom, the beam revealed a corridor lined with heavy doors. Some hung open, their locks rusted through. Others were shut tight. The walls were bare concrete, water-streaked and scarred with old graffiti. Claire's notebook was already full of sketches from the upper floors, but here she hesitated to write. Here she felt the need to record with her camera instead. The first room she entered had once been a storage area. Wooden shelves sagged under the weight of collapsed boxes. Mice had chewed through paper, scattering fragments across the floor. But one corner held something that made her pause. A cluster of chairs, old, metal-framed, arranged in a rough circle. On the floor beneath them lay a scattering of cigarette butts, their filters long yellowed. Teenagers, she thought at first. A place to sneak down, away from the eyes of staff. But then her flashlight caught something else. Chalk markings on the floor, faint but still visible after all these years. Not playful doodles, not scribbles. Lines and words, partially erased, forming shapes she couldn't decipher. Her stomach tightened. This wasn't the kind of thing children left behind in boredom. This looked like ritual. She took photographs quickly, her hands shaking. Then she moved on. The second room was darker, its window covered with boards that blocked out all light. The air was thicker here, harder to breathe. In the far corner stood a row of lockers. Most were rusted shut, their hinges fused. But one, its door warped, gaped slightly open. Claire crouched and swung it wider. Inside were scraps of fabric, gray wool, the kind used in uniforms. Her fingers brushed the material. It crumbled instantly, but the buttons remained, tarnished brass stamped with the insignia of St. Mary's. She sat back on her heels. For a moment she saw the scene in her mind. Children dressing in these uniforms, sitting in classrooms, eating in the cafeteria, then vanishing into nothing. And now, this. Forgotten scraps left to rot in a locker no one had touched since 1992. The third door was heavier, metal rather than wood. It took her several minutes of shoulder pushes before the rusted hinges yielded. The smell inside hit her first. Damp earth and rot. The beam of her flashlight swept over the floor and caught on something that froze her in place. Bunk beds. Not the tidy rows upstairs in the dormitory halls. These were crude welded frames jammed into a windowless basement room. 4 sets in total, 8 bunks, each with a mattress, thin, stained, collapsing in the middle. The blankets were little more than rags now, but they were still tucked in. On one of the pillows lay a comb, brittle plastic, as though someone had set it down casually and never returned. Claire's throat tightened. She moved slowly, her recorder still running, her words hushed. Hidden dormitory, lower level, beds still made, personal items present. This was never in any report. On the far wall, something else waited. A row of hooks, rusted with time. On them hung several objects so decayed they barely held shape. Sweaters, jackets, a skirt. Uniform items again. She raised her camera and snapped photos, the flash briefly illuminating the room in stark white light. The sudden brightness revealed something on the wall above the hooks. Letters, scratched deep into the concrete. At first, she thought it was vandalism. Then she stepped closer and realized the scratches weren't random. They formed words. We were not alone. Her breath caught. She traced the grooves with her fingertips, feeling the depth of each mark. Whoever had carved it had done so in desperation, gouging until their hands must have bled. Her mind swirled with questions. Why had no one reported this room? How had investigators in 1992 missed it? Or worse, had they found it and chosen to leave it buried? As she stood there, the air heavy around her, Claire became aware of the silence pressing closer. She snapped. One more photo of the words before backing toward the door. The beam of her flashlight trembled over the bunks again, over the comb, the folded rags of sweaters, the scratched message on the wall. She stepped back into the corridor, her chest rising and falling in quick breaths. She knew then that the dormitory was not merely a ruin. It was evidence. It was a crime scene that had never been treated as one, and it was clear, beyond doubt, that someone, somewhere, had worked very hard to keep it sealed. What chilled her most wasn't the beds or the uniforms or even the words gouged into concrete. It was the realization that this basement, hidden beneath the school, had been arranged to house people, quietly, secretly, away from the world above, and someone had made sure it stayed hidden for 19 years. The discoveries in the basement changed everything. Claire knew immediately she couldn't keep them to herself. Within days, she reached out to contacts at a state university, sending photographs of the scratched message, the uniforms, and the crude beds. She didn't dare transport anything herself. The building was unstable, and she feared disturbing the evidence, but she needed experts to verify what she had found. It wasn't easy convincing anyone to take her seriously. The case was nearly 2 decades old, officially closed. Most people she contacted assumed her interest was little more than a bid to sell a ghost story. But eventually, a forensic anthropologist agreed to drive down. His name was Dr. Warren, a man with lined eyes and a patience that masked a quiet anger toward forgotten cases. They entered the dormitory together. Claire led him into the basement room with the bunks. Doctor, Warren crouched in silence, examining the remnants. He scraped fibers from the decayed mattresses into vials, lifted rusted buttons into bags, and ran gloved hands over the words gouged into concrete. When he finally spoke, his voice carried no trace of doubt. Someone lived down here. For how long, I can't say yet. But this wasn't storage. This was habitation. Laboratory tests confirmed his instinct. The fibers were consistent with the uniforms worn in 1992. The stains on the mattresses, once tested, showed traces of human proteins. Blood in small amounts, too degraded to match but enough to suggest injuries had occurred. The comb still carried strands of hair, fragile, brittle, but undeniably human. The shock of those results spread quickly once Claire published her first piece. Local papers picked up the story. Secret basement found in abandoned dormitory. Families of the vanished demanded the case be reopened. For the first time in 19 years, Weatherford's silence broke. But the louder the public outcry grew, the more resistance Claire encountered. The county sheriff dismissed her findings as misinterpretation. Former school board members denied ever knowing the basement existed. And when she requested access to archived financial records of St. Mary's, her application was delayed. Again and again. It was only through a sympathetic clerk, a woman tired of the town's long silence, that Claire finally gained access. The records, kept in dusty ledgers, revealed something strange. Year after year, in the final decade before the disappearance, the school received funding far beyond its enrollment numbers. Government grants, private donations, and something, labeled simply as Special Accommodations Stipend. Claire cross-checked the figures against alumni lists. That's when she saw the second pattern. The names didn't match. Dozens of students were listed on the registries, their tuition payments marked, their attendance recorded. Yet when she searched for them in census data, voter rolls, or later, school transfers, they vanished. No trace. It was as if they had existed only on paper. and some of those names appeared again in police notes from 1992, students supposedly interviewed as witnesses in the days after the disappearance. Students who, by all other records, had never existed at all. The implication clawed at her chest. Fabricated students. False identities used to inflate numbers, to justify funding. But for what purpose? Where did the money go? She dug deeper. Among the ledgers was a folder of correspondence between the headmaster and a donor, whose name appeared again and again, the Harris Fund. Claire had never heard of it. The letters were vague, full of platitudes about continuing support and ensuring the program thrives. But tucked inside one envelope was a single sheet that made her skin crawl. It listed the number 10, 10 students, 10 stipends, 10 rooms allocated. The date? Spring of 1992. The same season the group vanished. Claire sat back in her chair, the weight of the page pressing into her mind. The basement bunks, the fabricated records, the withheld evidence. It wasn't random. It was patterned. Someone had been channeling money through the school for reasons no one wanted to explain. And in 1992, the pattern had ended abruptly, with 10 people gone. She returned to Weatherford with her findings, determined to confront those who had been in power. But when she arranged interviews with former staff, she found doors closed in her face. One man, a former administrator now living in a nearby county, agreed to meet her at a diner. His hands shook as he stirred his coffee. "You don't understand," he said, his eyes darting to the window as though expecting someone to be watching. "We were told not to ask questions. The funding was unusual, but it kept the school open. It kept us paid. Then the disappearances happened, and we were told to shut it down. End of story." "Who told you?" Claire pressed. He looked at her, his face pale. "People with more power than you want to imagine." When she showed him the page referencing 10 stipends, his lips quivered. "Burn that," he whispered, "before it burns you." Then he slid out of the booth and left, his unfinished coffee still steaming. That night, Claire sat in her motel room, the documents spread across the bed. She recorded into her tape deck, her voice low but steady. Patterns are emerging. False. Registries, inflated records, funds tied to an outside entity. The number 10 repeats, in payments, in stipends, in the final year before the disappearances. Someone engineered this. Someone knew what was happening in that dormitory basement, and someone wanted it buried. She switched off the recorder, but the silence pressed heavier than before. She couldn't escape the feeling that she wasn't just uncovering a forgotten case. She was prying open something that had been deliberately sealed, and somewhere between the basement beds and the red-penciled note, between the Harris Fund and the vanished registries, lay the truth. But if she followed it to the end, she had to accept the possibility. The truth might not only explain the past, it might still be dangerous in the present. Claire returned to the dormitory with a single thought pounding through her head. There had to be more. The basement bunks, the scratched words, the false registries, they weren't the end of the story. They were fragments. She hadn't yet found the place where all of it converged. She carried with her a copy of the basement blueprints, unearthed, from county archives. At first glance, the layout matched what she'd walked through. Stairwell, corridor, storage, a few sealed rooms. But when she traced her finger along the penciled lines, she noticed a blank space. A void where no doors were marked, no dimensions recorded. A hollow square of nothingness pressed between two basement walls. Her pulse quickened. If the blueprints were accurate, there was a hidden chamber. She returned at dusk, flashlight in hand. The town had grown restless since her articles. Some supported her, hungry for truth. Others wanted her gone, muttering that she was stirring up shadows better left undisturbed. She ignored the looks and the whispered warnings. In the basement, she followed the blueprint, pressing her hands against the concrete walls. Her knuckles rapped hollow in one spot, the sound different, softer, almost like wood layered beneath plaster. She crouched low, sweeping her beam across the wall until it caught on something faint. A seam, barely visible under paint and grime. She pressed harder. The panel shifted. Dust fell into her eyes. She shoved, coughed, and then the slab gave way, with a long groan. The smell that rushed out was worse than anything she had encountered before, a heavy, suffocating mix of mildew, earth, and something metallic that turned her stomach. She stepped inside. The hidden chamber was small, square, and suffocating. The walls were lined not with beds but with shelves, and on those shelves were objects that made her hand tremble as she lifted her camera. Notebooks, dozens of them. She picked one up carefully. The cover was cracked, the paper inside yellowed. The first page bore a child's handwriting, neat but shaky. "We write so we won't forget." Her heart thudded as she turned the pages. Each notebook was filled with entries, short, clipped sentences, fearful notes about life in the basement, mentions of being moved down at night, whispers about visitors who came and went, men who didn't speak to them but carried clipboards, checked lists, left envelopes. One entry in particular stopped her cold. "Mr. C says we are part of a program. That's why we're here. We have to be quiet. If anyone asks, we don't exist." The notebooks belonged to the vanished, their voices, preserved in pencil and ink, buried where no one was meant to find them. Her hands shook as she opened another. This one bore a drawing, crude figures lined up in bunks, a man at the door. Underneath, a sentence scrawled with broken grammar, "We don't want to stay here anymore." Claire's throat tightened. These weren't just traces. This was testimony, proof that the students hadn't vanished willingly, proof that the adults with them hadn't been protectors, but captors. She dug deeper into the shelves. Behind the notebooks lay folders stamped with the insignia of the Harris Fund. Inside, spreadsheets detailed payments, allocations, and lists of participants. The language was clinical, stripped of humanity, yet the numbers matched the false registries exactly. 10 stipends, 10 lives. 10 people held in a basement while the outside world believed they were safe in classrooms above. The realization hit her like a blow. The disappearances weren't sudden. They were covered. The children and staff had been hidden away deliberately, treated as if they never existed, while the school funneled money through their names. And when the program collapsed in 1992, the entire group had been erased, in body, in record, in memory. But there was one final horror waiting in the corner of the chamber, a shallow pit dug into the floor, covered with warped boards. Claire hesitated, her flashlight beam shaking as she nudged the boards aside. What lay beneath was not bones. Time and decay had taken too much for that. But fragments remained. Small, brittle, unmistakable. Teeth, shards of fabric, bits of hair, clumped into dust. She stumbled back, bile rising in her throat. The chamber wasn't just a hiding place, it was a grave. The truth crystallized. The 10 had never left the dormitory. They had been kept beneath it, written out of existence, and when the funding dried up or the operation was threatened, they had been disposed of where no one would look. Her camera snapped photo after photo, each flash lighting the room in harsh white bursts. She recorded her voice through tears, her words shaking. Hidden. Chamber discovered. Notebooks confirm captivity. Funding tied to Harris Fund. Remains present. This is the end of the story. The children and staff never left. They died here, under the school that swore to protect them. When she emerged from the dormitory hours later, dawn was breaking over Weatherford. The building loomed behind her, its windows catching the first gray light. She felt both triumph and dread. The families would finally have answers. Brutal, devastating answers. The town would never bury the truth again. But she also knew the story was bigger than Weatherford. The Harris Fund wasn't a ghost. It was real, and its fingerprints were still on the documents she carried. Uncovering this secret chamber might close one case, but it had opened a larger question. How many other schools, how many other institutions, had hidden their silence the same way? The truth had emerged at last. But it wasn't the kind of truth that brought peace. It was the kind that left scars.